Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 650 lecture. And we'll be discussing legal and ethical issues in archives. So here are weekly topics for this week. What is copyright? What is fair use? What is the difference between copyright and fair use? How can copyright impact access to archival collections? What ethical standards should archivists be held to and why? And how can archives balance privacy with access? So we'll be looking at all of our learning objectives during this lecture and touching on them periodically. So I'll start by talking about a little bit about the difference between legal considerations and ethical arguments in archives. In the Bingo article, the author talks about how legal considerations are mostly aimed towards not getting in trouble, right? Not having some kind of negative impact arise from breaking the laws of the land. Whereas ethical arguments are mostly based on a relationship of trust that exists between the repository, the donor, and society. So it's not necessarily the case that if archives violate ethical arguments, they're going to get in legal trouble, but they may violate sort of perceived social norms, and that can have some negative impacts when it comes to uh, operating as an archive in general. And we'll touch a little bit more on this later on down the road. But you're unlikely to get into any actual legal trouble. So we'll talk about copyright, which is mostly a legal consideration, kind of cut and dry. And then we'll also focus on privacy, which in a lot of ways is both a legal consideration and an ethical consideration or discussion that archives need to have. Okay, so uh, we'll talk about copyright just a little bit. Copyright law is incredibly complex. Um, I doubt that there is anyone really that understands it completely. But just generally speaking, uh, there's some facts about copyright. So essentially, it's a form of protection for original works. So if you create an original work, then you have copyright law on your side to protect your financial interests related to that original work. So it's important to note for the sake of archives that copyright covers both published and unpublished works. So if you, for instance, receive a unpublished manuscript or something, an unpublished play in an archival collection, that manuscript is still copyrighted even though it wasn't ever published or performed anyway. So copyright applies whether published or not. So just as a general rule, copyright lasts around the life of the author plus an additional 7 years. So quite a long length of time. Um, so, things can enter into copyright and remain copyrighted for a tremendous period of time. And as we'll talk about later, it's going to have some impact on how archives are able to provide access to materials that may be copyrighted. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the difference between physical and intellectual ownership. This is something that the Laura Millar chapter for this week touches on, but just because you have physical ownership of materials, whether they be archival records or any published or unpublished work, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have copyright of those materials. So unless copyright is specifically transferred along with physical custody, you most likely do not have copyright. So if I'm an author and I donate, manuscripts of my works to an archive, the archive has possession of those physical manuscripts, but they don't have copyright over that particular work. Most likely, I'm going to retain that because I want to continue to make money off of my manuscripts. Um, and it may be the case that donors can transfer that copyright to archives, or it may be the case that the owner does not have the copyright to materials in their possession, and therefore they can't transfer them. So an interesting example of this is earlier on in one of our discussion posts, some of you looked at some movie posters from a collection that is held by the American Heritage Center. So the gentleman who donated those posters to the AHC, gave those posters to the AHC. He gave them physical custody of those posters as part of his donation. But 20th Century Fox or whoever created the films or created those posters still owns copyright for those posters. So if the HC were to try and go out and sell prints of those posters, then they would probably get in trouble because they were infringing on the copyright for those posters, even though they own, physical copies of them. So physical ownership does not necessarily mean you own the copyright or you have ownership of the intellectual property, and that's something the archives have to be kind of careful to navigate around. So one way that archives can get around copyright is through what is called fair use, and so this is defined in Section 108 of the U.S. Code. And this is coming from the American Library Association. So library and archives may reproduce, distribute, display, or perform in facsimile or digital form any work in the last 20 years of its copyright term for purposes of preservation, scholarship, or research. So there's a little bit of wiggle room here. If you are an archive, then you are able to make copies of things as long as it's not for profit, as long as you're doing it to promote preservation, research, scholarship, other things like that that are protected under fair use. In order to use Section 108 and to use fair use, typically an archive or library has to be open to the public, so private archives may not be able to claim fair use because someone has to pay to use them. So essentially, the archive is profiting from the use of materials which are under copyright. But generally speaking, most public and academic libraries and archives will qualify. So that's definitely a way that archives can get around, in most cases, some of the concerns about copyright when they're trying to preserve and provide access to archival materials. Now, according to the U.S. Copyright Office, there are a few other considerations that come into the determination of fair use. So the purpose and character of the use. So again, commercial in nature versus nonprofit. The nature of the copyrighted work. So typically if a copyrighted work is nonfiction or factual as opposed to something that is created for entertainment purposes, fair use is more likely to be appropriate. The amount of work is a consideration. So if you're just using a small percentage of a manuscript uh, and you're claiming it's fair use, then that is going to be different than if you're using, half of a manuscript or, half of a person's album of photographs. So just the amount of material that is copyrighted that is being used, excuse me, and the effect of the use upon the potential market for the copyrighted work. So if what you are doing as an archive is going to create a situation in which the person who owns the copyright of the work to lose money or to be able to not make as much money as they would otherwise, then that may complicate claims of fair use. And it's important to note that a lot of archives get caught up in copyright and they will oftentimes go out of their way, some would argue unnecessarily, to not risk antagonizing people who do hold copyright and may send them a nasty letter or a takedown request in the future. So, whether archives are in fair use or not, and again, typically they probably are going to be, they may take steps to reduce access to materials just out of fear of, again, potentially being sued, although that seems pretty unlikely unless, the archive does something really egregious, or, even just getting a nasty letter in the mail from a lawyer or someone's representative. So if you remember from the Stein article, the author talks about decreasing access to some newspaper clippings in the Louisiana room due to copyright concerns. They were worried that the newspaper was going to come and tell them, hey, you can't do this anymore, and they just didn't want to deal with that. So they required viewers to come to the reading room to view the clippings, despite the fact that this was a pretty popular resource for researchers to use. So that's just one example, I'm sure, of many, 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 where the fear of copyright has led archives to take steps to reduce their legal exposure. Necessarily or unnecessarily, you'll be the judge. Okay, so next we will turn our focus on privacy and the need in the archival profession to balance privacy and access when making record keeping choices surrounding records. The Dresser article notes that finding this balance is hindered by a lack of policies and procedures developed by archives. So oftentimes archives may not have a lot of understanding of what their institution wants them to do or what their institution expects them to do. And that can lead to archivists making choices on their own. And how informed those choices are, probably will vary from archivist to archivist and situation to situation, and may possibly even be according to things like different moral codes or moral standards, or varying desires to protect people represented in records. So there are a whole lot of ways where, because of this lack of policies and procedures, decisions on privacy and decisions on access to records can get pretty subjective pretty quickly. Another complicating factor that the Dresser article notes is a lack of agreement on what privacy is, so what privacy even means. I think if you ask someone to describe privacy, they might be able to find some pretty straightforward answers, right? Like I expect to have the privacy of, being able to be in my home and not have someone looking through my windows or whatever. I expect the privacy to be able to go to the bathroom and not sort of be disturbed or interrupted. Although, if you have small children, that's usually more of an aspiration than, an actual fact. But when you try and impose thoughts of privacy onto, privacy represented within records and, within information. Again, it can get pretty subjective pretty quickly. And I think with social media and cameras everywhere and, cookies and other online tools, I think the expectation for privacy that a lot of people have has unfortunately been pretty degraded over the years. And it's interesting to see how that would impact how archivists of varying sort of vintages would feel about what privacy is and what privacy isn't. Um, but the Bingo article attempts to kind of codify this a little bit. So Bingo talks about how within any given context, one can begin to define privacy norms according to the type of information shared. So if it's intimate information being shared between people, like talking about, you know, a lover or how one person thinks someone else is a jerk, that may um, be more inclined to be considered private information than if something is just like, oh, how was the weather? Um, the means by which information is shared. So was it a personal note between two people? Was it something that, I posted on Facebook? Probably not going to expect that to be very private since, essentially it's meant to be seen by other people, right? The people sharing the information. So is it me sharing things with my spouse, or again, is it me just kind of sharing something with a bunch of strangers on the internet? And those who are the subject of the information. So typically, if children are involved in some way, that may lead people to feel like there's more of a need and expectation for privacy than for adults, for example. So despite this uncertainty in a lot of instances over what privacy is, the Dresser article states that around 89% of the respondents that replied to their survey um, face privacy choices fairly regularly. So it's something that comes up a lot during the archival profession. One thing that the Dresser article mentions is using legal resources to try and help an archive and archivists understand what privacy is. But Dresser notes that oftentimes legal resources are going to tend to err on the side of caution, right? They don't want to be sued. They don't want to have any legal complications. So they'll probably just say, when in doubt, don't provide access to records. However, Bingo notes that Mark Green argues that outside of information restricted by law, archives should provide access. So unless there's an explicit law saying something should be restricted, or maybe something in a donor agreement, excuse me, then archives should just go ahead and provide access to it, and that is sort of the best thing to do. The Bingo article does note a couple of instances where uh, archivists feel that the American Archivist Code of Ethics recommends, excuse me, that archivists safeguard the privacy of individuals in archival collections, and the archivists have a moral need or obligation to protect privacy. And I think this sort of echoes what Bingo says about why privacy is important for legal reasons, because archivists don't want to be sued by people, which is something that the Dresser article touches on. But also because donors might withhold records if they suspect that archives will not preserve their privacy. So if donors feel that archives are sort of violating social norms by providing access to private materials in their collections, then they might say, okay, well, I'm just not going to donate my materials to archives and they're going to be lost to history. So, perhaps Green's um, encouragement to, accept and except for legal reasons to ignore donors' needs for privacy completely may not be uh, terribly constructive for the archival profession in the long run. And again, as I have here, it has to be a balance, right? Archives need to be able to provide access to materials, and oftentimes it's the private stuff that is the real juicy stuff and really portrays an individual's or an organization's activities in the most accurate light. But at the same time, um, you know, archives need to have some kind of way to be deliberate and careful about what they're providing access to, and sort of thinking about why they're making the choices that they are. And again, it is a balance. So I touched on um, legal laws that are meant to protect privacy. So obviously the big ones are HIPAA and FERPA, which the Dresser article discusses. So HIPAA protects your medical information, FERPA protects your academic information. So these are two things that are fairly straightforward that archives can look at and say, okay, we know, what we're expected to keep private, and here's a pretty good description of what those records look like. And that can be really useful, and it can provide a pretty clear framework for archives to work in. But of course, there are a lot of materials that don't necessarily apply to HIPAA or FERPA, right? If I write a letter to a friend, talking about, um, you know, how much I really don't like working where I'm working, and then, that comes out uh, 20 years later because it's in an archive now, or as the Dresser article notes, if someone is accused of a crime or is involved in a crime, that's not something that's protected by HIPAA or FERPA. And so there are obviously privacy concerns and examples that can fall outside of these two legal frameworks, but nonetheless, they do serve as uh, useful sort of references and frameworks to work within. Um, it may not be that archives are the best at interpreting HIPAA or FERPA. You may want to, again, work with your legal counsel to try and get any clarification that you might need. But I take FERPA training like every year, and it's not terribly complicated. So for the most part, it's not too difficult to figure out, and it can be a useful sort of screening mechanism to use when you're making decisions about the balance between privacy and access. So complicating this whole question of privacy is increased access. So the further along you get along this sort of continuum of access, the more likely it is that a person's privacy is going to be violated. So something like those clippings in the Louisiana room are closed, and you have to go to the reading room to look at them and to use them. That's going to restrict the number of people that are ever going to see those materials, simply because it's not convenient for as many people to go to Louisiana as it is for people to just click onto a website and view things that way. So, that's something else that archives should consider as well. Maybe it's fine that we provide unfettered access to these records in the reading room, but maybe we should think twice before we publish them in our digital collections, and everyone can see them, no matter where they are. Um, so that's certainly a consideration that archives have to make. And it's interesting to think of a situation in which a person donates their papers, not really realizing that someday down the road they may be placed online for people to look at. And the Dresser article has an example of that. So the article talks about a donor who said, if I had known that these were going to be placed online, then we would have had a different conversation about about the donation of my records. Maybe the donor would want to restrict them or take some other step to prevent prevent online access from happening. So, ethically speaking, should archives be required to uh, contact the donor of materials before records are placed online at all? Technically the archives own the records, so more or less they can do whatever they want, assuming they're not violating copyright. But is it the ethical thing to do to at least call someone and speak with them and at least give them a heads up? Again, this kind of touches on the differences between legal considerations and ethical arguments. Another ethical consideration that archives have to weigh when thinking about privacy is the concept of third-party rights or blind donor rights. And this is something that the Hamer article touches on a little bit, talking about how web users are blind donors due to ignorance of the collection, preservation, study of their data captured by governments and private corporations. And there are blind donors in archives as well. So say I write that letter to a friend about how I don't like working where I'm working, and that friend donates those letters to an archive, and I have no idea that that's happened. And all of a sudden, people are like, "Wow, we found out that you didn't really like your job," and that could potentially have negative repercussions for me down the road. But I had no idea that these records were being donated, and I didn't consent to that in any way. But still, my privacy is being violated. Um, and that's a complicating factor. What ethical responsibility do archives have to protect the rights of people that didn't donate archival records but may be represented within them? Um, you know, a lot of times archives are just going to say, well, that's sort of beyond our capability to find out who these people are and track them down and do whatever we can. But it is something that can potentially harm someone in the future. Someone could be outed, someone could, be blackmailed, or there are a lot of things that can happen if private information is found in archival records. And it's especially um, unfortunate if this information about you is found in records that you didn't even donate and you had nothing to do with their donation. So that's certainly something the archives should be mindful of as well. Okay, so next we'll talk about some ways that archives can go about locating potentially private information within archival collections. So, assuming that you have some idea of what it is you need to be looking for, whether it's because you know about FERPA and HIPAA, or you've gotten legal guidance, or just from your experience working in the field and working with donors, how do archives actually go about finding this information? Um, well, one option is sort of the brute force option, where you just go through every single item that you receive and you try and identify all of the different potentially private information that you come across. And of course, this can be pretty labor intensive if you're looking at collections that might be, you know, hundreds and hundreds of boxes, each of them containing, hundreds and hundreds of records, to go through all of those and to try and find every piece of potentially private information. That's going to require a ton of work and a lot of resources that not a lot of archives are going to be able to muster, and probably shouldn't muster in all honesty. So just the size of modern collections and how massive they are can really make this a difficult strategy to implement even irregularly. One thing that is interesting to think about is the potentiality of using AI and other digital search tools to find private information within archival collections. I've heard of this happening in some instances. If you have, correspondence that you can scan and then you can, do word searches or use other tools to find potentially incriminating information, or not incriminating, but potentially private information. That's something that you could do. So, with digital records, it might be slightly more feasible to do something like this than with analog records, where you're pretty much going to have to read through everything. But still, if you're looking at, terabytes and terabytes of digital information within an archive, it can still be a whole lot of work, and not every archive certainly has the ability to use, AI or other tools to facilitate this kind of search. One strategy that the Stern article mentions is, I'm sorry, the Stein article mentions is when materials are requested by researchers, before the researcher even sees those records, someone goes through and looks through them to make sure that there aren't any privacy issues going on. So kind of like um, a made-to-order preservation screening, um, to sort of an understanding of what information researchers might potentially be accessing, and hopefully heading off any potential problems at the past. So this is probably more economical than just looking through everything, right? Because, you know, not every record in an archive is actually going to be looked at and used. So maybe it's less important to look through that stuff. But if you know something is going to be looked at by a researcher, then sure, it makes sense to spend a little bit of time looking through those records, and just seeing what might be in there. But still sometimes researchers can request, boxes and boxes of collection material. So you still might have a lot of work that needs to be done in order to do this kind of made to order privacy screening activity. And as the Stein article mentions, it does require researchers to make an appointment, which can um, just make their lives more difficult if they need to do research sooner rather than later. So that's a potentially negative uh, response or result of this type of privacy screening efforts. One good thing about this is it could be cumulative over time. So if you had researchers who are looking at the same material, you would only have to do this once, ideally. And, if you sort of work through your collection materials bit by bit, then over time, you can have a lot of your collection material screened. So that could certainly be a benefit to this type of privacy screening as well. And next, we will talk about contextual integrity, which is the focus of the Bingo article, which I have always enjoyed reading and talking about, especially because I really like the idea of someone having the last name Bingo. Um, so I guess I'm easily amused, but hey, his last name is Bingo, and that's pretty cool. So yeah, contextual integrity essentially ascribes to the fact that, as the Bingo article states, quoting Nissenbaum, when information is divulged within one context and is recast in another context, contextual integrity is broken. So if I write someone a letter for a purpose, and then for whatever reason that record is used for a different purpose or within a different context, that violates the contextual integrity of that correspondence. Which honestly makes me think, does every use of archival material violate contextual integrity? Because not a lot of people are creating records because they want them to be looked at in the future, right? It's usually just kind of an organic process. So I guess if you took the idea of contextual integrity far enough, every use of archives would violate this, and no one should look at anything. Um, that's obviously not what Bingo is saying, but you can take anything sort of as far as you want, right? But essentially, the idea is to look at the interactions between the people that are being represented in records. So if it seems like the positions of the people corresponding may make it more likely that there's private communication going on, like if people have a close relationship, if people are sharing information in an intimate way, like a letter from one person to another, then that may lead you to have more of a sense that there might be some privacy issues contained within those materials. So ideally, you're identifying factors that may bear upon the sensitivity of a record. So again, looking at some of the things I talked about before, like the nature of the relationship between two people, the context that the records are created in. And the great thing about this is it allows you to focus your efforts on a certain set of records and not necessarily have to search through every record in the collection. So if one part of a collection is correspondence between two people and the other part of a collection is, publications that someone did or more public facing materials, you probably don't need to worry about privacy issues in the public facing materials, and you can just focus your efforts on materials like interpersonal correspondence, which tends to be um, more personal, more intimate, and maybe more likely to contain potentially privacy violating information. So the idea is that you're not doing item level searching, but it's more based on looking at things like different functions, different relationships, and just sort of the context in which records were created. One interesting thing that the Bingo article notes about contextual integrity is that information shared within an intimate relationship can have a high degree of research value. If you it can be sort of the rich stuff within a relationship, which tends to be more private. And if you sort of go out of your way to identify all this stuff and restrict it and make it inaccessible, it really begs the question of what's left over and what are you providing to researchers. So again, if you sort of take this idea of contextual integrity so far that you are squeezing out all the good stuff, all the information that really illustrates who a person was or what an organization did or is doing, then kind of leaving researchers to look at a representation of a person's life or an organization's history that is not very factual and doesn't contain a lot of the information that it may otherwise. So to contextualize this a little bit more, haha, just see what I did there. If you are looking at information that is likely private and has low research value, then you might just say, all right, this doesn't really seem like it's worth for us to bring into the archive or to provide a lot of access to. Like maybe this is stuff that we're not going to focus on um, digitizing when we decide which records in a collection to digitize because it's not really worth having to navigate all the privacy risks for materials that aren't really useful to researchers in the first place. But if you have materials that do document an important function, that have high research value but may contain some private information, then those are things that you should really consider acquiring and potentially providing a wider access to. So moving them further along the access continuum that I discussed earlier on in this lecture. So it's just a way to sort of visualize what types of materials you may want to focus on and consider providing greater access to within the realm of contextual integrity. And attaching it to appraisal and access choices, and we'll talk a little bit more about appraisal as it relates to privacy and other ethical considerations in just a minute. So the Miller article focuses on some of the different archival ethical frameworks established by professional archival organizations and some of the different things that these frameworks should address. So in our readings for this week, there's a fair amount of skepticism towards uh, ethical frameworks or codes of ethics from archival organizations. The Hamer article says that they're by and large weak. You know, much like anything, they're pretty open to interpretation, and at the end of the day, you can kind of twist words and use them essentially to justify pretty much whatever you want to do in the first place. You know, if you violate archival codes of ethics, you're not going to like get kicked out of the profession. It's sort of like the codes of ethics that quote unquote that the Supreme Court recently adopted. It's like, okay, there's no like enforcement mechanism, so these are pretty much useless, and they're probably just going to do what you were doing before, and you know, essentially, it's useless. I guess it's a good sort of like framework for aspirational behavior, but again, you know, unless these codes of ethics are addressing every possible like permutation of different issues that archives face, and there's actually some enforcement mechanism, you know, by and large pretty weak, but they do raise some interesting. I'm sorry, the Miller chapter does raise some interesting things that, at least in the author's opinion, archival ethical framework should address, and we'll talk about those and connect them to some of the things that we've talked about in the class for most of the rest of this lecture. So looking at respect for the integrity of records, impartiality and transparency, professional competency, respect for human rights, respect for rule of law, and respect for an archivist's own well-being. So connecting legal and ethical issues in appraisal and sort of thinking of them within the framework of the different things that Lord Miller suggests archivists need to at least consider when developing codes of ethics and when engaging in archival practice. There are definitely some connections with appraisal. So impartiality and transparency, being transparent about the appraisal decisions that you've made and why you have made them. You know, again, this isn't something that archives are legally required to do, but it may be something that researchers or other members of society expect archives to do so that there's a greater understanding of why archives made the choices that they made about which records to accept. You know, impartiality. Are you being biased against a particular group or a particular organization because you don't like them or you don't agree with them? And if so, you could argue that that is pretty unethical appraisal. Respect for human rights. You know, if you are an archive that is in a position to uh, accept records during appraisal that can support human rights efforts, you know, then that's something that uh, assuming there's some connection to the archives material that archivists would feel is an ethical responsibility that archives have. To focus on privacy and how that relates to appraisal and even copyright as well. You know, appraisal is a good time to find out any copyright issues or privacy issues that might be located in a collection. And that's something that the idea of contextual integrity advocates for, you know, working with donors to find out what kind of private information might be in a collection, what kind of materials might be in there that are copyrighted, and that is something that archives can consider when making their appraisal choices. So if a collection is full of stuff that's copyrighted and you're not really going to be able to provide access to for, you know, 20 or 70 years, then maybe it's not the best collection. If it's full of a bunch of private information, then that may make the collection more useful and valuable to the archives and to researchers, but it can let the archives know that there are some things that they're going to have to navigate through when deciding how to make these records accessible to the public. Okay, looking at processing, respect for the integrity of records. So making sure that you are arranging and inscribing records correctly so that the integrity of the records is preserved in that way. Being transparent about the arrangement and descriptive choices that you've made can be an ethical consideration or a responsibility that archives might have. Impartiality, so not using negative or denigrating language to describe individuals or organizations. That's certainly an ethical responsibility that archives have. Professional competency, just making sure that you are carrying out arrangement inscription in a way that is correct and is as truthful and accurate as possible, because if that happens, then you're less likely to mislead people or make them think that, um, you know, make it less likely that you're presenting them with information that is incorrect and is going to mislead them. Also, some connections to privacy. When you are arranging and describing records, it's a good idea to use that time to further identify any potentially private information that you're coming across. As you're sort of working with the records, that's a good opportunity to kind of see what you're dealing with. And again, one of the criticisms of MPLP and of a more cursory view towards processing is that it can result in a lot of potentially private information and even copyright information as well being overlooked, and the archives not knowing about the issues that are potentially found within their collections. All right, looking at preservation, certainly respect for the integrity of the records is important. You want to carry out preservation in a way that preserves the integrity of the content and context of the records in your archive. Transparency, you need to be transparent about the preservation actions that you have taken. If records have been migrated, if they've been conserved, you probably have an ethical responsibility to make researchers aware of that so they can take that into consideration when doing research. Respect for human rights. As I talked about before when I discussed preservation, certain cultures may have perspectives on how records should be preserved. And if archives intentionally violate those, then that's not really being respectful of the human rights of cultures represented in those records or communities that those records came from. So pretty unethical. Again, not illegal necessarily, but pretty unethical. Okay, so digital preservation, kind of the same thing. If you're migrating records, you should let researchers know. In some ways, you could argue that migration does violate a respect for the integrity of records to a certain extent. And again, that's just something that archives have to weigh when preserving digital records. So is digital preservation unethical when it comes to migration? I mean, maybe you can make that argument. And you could say that things like emulation are the more ethical choice for archives to make. Um, you know, you might get booed out of a digital preservation session at an archival conference if you said that, but would you be wrong? Not necessarily. We'll also talk about the connections between research or services. Um, again, impartiality, it's a big one. I talked about how as um, you want to be as helpful to a researcher working with your records, no matter who they are and what they're asking for. If they're asking for records that you don't really find interesting, or if the person is disagreeable with you, ethically speaking, you should still do your best to help them, no matter what sort of issues are going on in the background. That's a pretty straightforward ethical obligation that that archivists have. When it comes to privacy, there are a lot of privacy issues that can crop up during research or services. Um, you know, you obviously want to keep your researchers as anonymous as possible. You don't want to share with one person research that another person is doing without their permission. Um, there might be information that you come across in archival records that you need to screen or uh, protect in some way when you're providing that information to researchers. So if you're scanning things, you may need to go in and kind of redact things like social security numbers or whatever. So that's another instance where archives may come into contact with private information that they hadn't before, and obviously they need to do something about that before they give that information to researchers. And oftentimes, when researchers are coming in to use materials, that's when archivists will educate them about copyright and say, here's what copyright is. Essentially, if you use our materials, if you use our research or services, you're taking responsibility for copyright, and we're not gonna we're not going to be the ones that are going to get in trouble. So that's a good time to educate the public about what copyright is and how it might impact the work that they're doing in the future. And we'll also talk about social justice, something that we have not talked about in this course yet, but we will here in just a few weeks. A big one is respect for human rights. There's a lot of discussion in the archival profession about whether or not archives should be involved in social justice issues. People that are for that kind of involvement say that archives have an ethical responsibility to help people use archival records in a way that can empower them and help them be successful in society, as a community, as a culture. As we'll discuss when we talk about social justice in archives, not everyone agrees that archives should be involved in that kind of work. Um, but some people feel that archives do have that ethical responsibility to be involved in these efforts. And sometimes, being involved in social justice can uh, result or demand that archives not respect the rule of law. If an archivist comes into a situation where they feel like respecting human rights compels them to violate privacy, to violate things like property laws, that's an ethical choice that archives have to make. And you know, if someone feels compelled that they need to do that, then they can make a strong ethical argument that their choice is the correct one. But again, what is lawful isn't always ethical, right? And that's something that archives certainly have to contend with when supporting or not supporting social justice issues. Okay, but no matter how archives interpret privacy and other legal obligations, or I'm sorry, other ethical obligations that they may or may not have, connects to creatorship in archives, and especially this connection to creation by archivists. The decisions that archivists make about what should be considered private and what shouldn't be considered private does have a strong impact on the information that researchers have to work with in the future, and can shape how society understands a person or an organization, or a government, or something in history. And so that can have a strong creative impact on social memory and the information that the public has to work with in the future. If I decide that someone's racy letters to someone else is just too much for a society to bear, then that information, could potentially be lost forever. And that's a pretty strong impact that archives can have, and a strong creative role. So just how archives navigate this potentially um, complicated, not potentially, definitely complicated and subjective balance between legal responsibilities and ethical considerations. What is private and what isn't private? How do we make that determination? What do we do about it? That can have a pretty influential role. And it's something that archives need to be cognizant of, something that archives need to be transparent about. It's something that archives need to do when considering things like impartiality and transparency, when considering things like the rule of law and respect for human rights. And it's a big, messy, complicated issue. But it is something that archives are forced to deal with, fairly regularly, and if you end up in the profession, you will end up having to deal with it um, as well. And you just kind of have to get all the information that you can and make the best choice that you can. And it's always good to ask other people what they think. But yeah, it can definitely be a thorny set of issues to wade through. Um, and I guess all I can say is good luck, and I hope you don't get sued. Okay, I'll go ahead and wrap up things there. Thank you for listening. Hopefully, you're more aware of the different ethical considerations that archives face. Um, and yeah, ethics is always a really interesting thing to consider. And I hope that you have been interested by our readings for this week. And as always, please let me know if you have any questions.